Your hard-earned tax dollars are funding institutionalized learning on mis- and disinformation by supposed experts, and we want Canadians to know what is being shared and how much it all costs. Tamara Ugolini here with Rebel News to bring you a recent phenomenon being funded by the Canadian taxpayer, which is funneling money to the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, or the CIHR. In February of this year, they posted a training opportunity in science communication, which would, offer several training opportunities in science communication that are free of charge for participants and available to health researchers across Canada. Participants must be based at a Canadian post-secondary or research institute, and only those with Canadian post-secondary or research institute email addresses can register. To ensure that only the proper people get into these training sessions, CIHR actively monitors the registration lists and will remove ineligible registrants. So because these are completely inaccessible to the lay people, to you and me, but the content of which will affect us all, here at Rebel News, we have filed an access to information request with this government-funded institution to obtain the slideshow deck and determine how much the speaker was paid for this crucial engagement. And you can find that work at rebelinvestigates.com. See, this session we inquired about specifically was called Combating Misinformation on Social Media. The description reads, "It's important for researchers to respond swiftly to mis- and disinformation. However, in a digital age where disinformers are savvy with how they attack facts and those sharing them, it is important we debunk mindfully and strategically." In this keynote, research scientist turned science communicator Samantha Yamin, also known as Science Sam, will share the importance and pitfalls of sharing science on social media with lessons learned from the comms, the communications front lines during the pandemic. She'll also share best practices and tips for effective myth busting before a lively discussion. This is a session you'll want to tune in for before sending out that next hot take of a tweet. Her session ran on March 28th from 12 to 1 p.m. But who is Science Sam, and why is she preaching to academics about mis- and disinformation? It appears that Sam completed a Bachelor of Science at the University of Toronto in 2012 and went on to obtain a doctorate in philosophy from the same in 2019. Science Sam is seen as early as 2018, parading around on the streets of downtown Toronto, donned in a white lab coat, holding a brain mold, being followed by, you guessed it, the CBC. She describes herself as a science commentator and is the co-founder and co-producer of the Science is a Drag event, where scientists apparently challenge the cis/heteronormative stereotypes of science. Sam was even listed as number 34 on Toronto Life's 50 Most Influential Torontonians for 2021 for her role as a TikTok star and COVID queen, for reaching the 16 to 24-year-old demographic with her coronavirus messaging, which apparently bridged a gap, making her the go-to COVID news source for the TikTok Gen. As the article points out, her then fiancé, now husband, is Rishi Nair, the co-founder and CEO of Pocket Health, a digital medical records and imaging database that saw a 300% spike in demand in the first months of the pandemic. According to this BetaKit article about Pocket Health from March 31st, 2022, they are now armed with $20 million Canadian in Series A financing led by healthcare-focused US-based investor Questa Capital and supported by existing Toronto investor Radical Ventures. Questa Capital's portfolio details heavy collaboration across medical services, medical data capturing, and pharmaceutical companies, while Radical Ventures is an artificial intelligence development firm dedicated to unlocking technology to reshape our world. What is it about those who profited off of the pandemic being the ones at the helm, ensuring that the general public is properly informed, while slandering and smearing everyone who questions the narrative? So in this time, Sam went from her role as researching brain development and stem cell recovery to shilling for the COVID-19 vaccines. Watch her prop up a colleague in a 3-part series hosted by the University of Toronto News called Talking Shots with Science Sam and U of T professor Christina Guzzos. Sam amplifies Guzzos mis and disinformation from May 20th, 2021. Listen for yourself.
The benefit of being vaccinated is that you provide a dead end for this virus. And the more dead ends we have out there in the community, there ends up being nowhere for the virus to go. And eventually that virus will die out. It will be eradicated. People talk about, they'd rather be infected naturally with COVID-19 than get vaccinated. Well, in fact, a real benefit is that your immune response to vaccination is far better. So it's stronger, it's more long lasting. It does a better job at protecting you versus someone who just got an immune response from a natural infection. And we see this, there's evidence of this in the real world. People who are vaccinated have much, much lower rates of reinfection, showing the benefit that a vaccination is more protective than a natural infection.
Wrong. COVID-19 vaccines never stop transmission or infection, and their own studies were never structured to study just that.
If you look at how vaccines, any vaccine is, I'll take this off so you can see me. So if you look at how any vaccine is brought to market, we test for efficiency and we test for effectiveness so that it stops the burden of disease becoming an illness. Transmission is then something which is almost like a byproduct of the effectiveness. So that transmission stops you passing the disease on to another person. There's no way that we could have studied that in the run-up
in the short amount of time.
To the people who needed it most urgently. And that's standard, whether it's an emergency, a pandemic, or anything else. You look at transmission in real-world effectiveness settings after the vaccine is licensed and on the market. And there are studies from Israel and other countries that have shown that the vaccine does have an impact on transmission.
A lot of indications right now that are telling us that there is a protection against transmission of the disease. There is no variant that we have identified that escapes the protection of our vaccine.
Against COVID, to come now with a treatment of 90% effectiveness, personally makes me very proud about
and we know that the 2 doses of the vaccine offer very limited protection, if any. The 3 doses with a booster, they offer reasonable protection against.
It is necessary a 4th boost right now. The protection that you are getting from the 3rd, it is good enough, actually quite good for hospitalizations and deaths. It's not that good against infections.
Well, in terms of the real-world data from April of 2022, it clearly showed that the more vaccinated you were, the more likely you were to develop a case of COVID-19. That's as per the Ontario Ministry of Health's own data, who stopped reporting cases, hospitalizations, and death rates by vaccination status a few months later, arguably because it no longer fit their safe and effective narrative. And natural immunity was always superior to artificial or vaccine-induced immunity. And in fact, the latest research from the New England Journal of Medicine shows that vaccination in children hindered their natural immunity. Those who were unvaccinated still had strong immunity after 16 months, whereas the vaccinated group, whether they had been previously infected or not, wanes within 5 to 7 months. But let's continue with Science Sam and her misinformation session.
Right now, our vaccines work really, really well. They are remarkable at protecting us.
I want to ask you, Christina, what are the risks of getting a COVID-19 vaccine? Because nothing is without risk.
I want to be really clear that the risks are very, very rare, but they're also very real. When we think about the risks of these vaccines, we also need to put this into perspective, in terms of the risks of other medical interventions that we've all taken. Typical pharmaceuticals, right? Drug treatments, prescribed medications that we all take. Elective surgeries and drug therapies that actually don't even have as high of a benefit as COVID-19 vaccination does. And so when we consider that, the risks and other risks that we take in our life, on a daily basis, I think it's safe to say that these risks are extremely low and acceptable. And I think we need to have faith in our regulatory agencies that when risks arise, we take them seriously and we act on them, we investigate them. But at the end of the day, we need to weigh the risks versus benefits. What about long-term risks? Well, if we look at sort of the history of vaccinology and vaccinations, typically all of these adverse events arise very early, within the first few weeks of a vaccination or of the treatment. So some people have been vaccinated for up to a year. Some of these trials started last March 2020. So we are well beyond that, risk window period where we're wondering what new adverse event might come up. Whatever we've seen up until now can be very representative of what we might see for the next years to come.
And about those rare reactions, if they're so rare, then why did Canada introduce the brand new Canadian Vaccine Injury Support Program, or VISP, at a whopping $32+ million that budgeted for 400 vaccine injury claims every year for 5 years from 2021 until the end of 2026? A program that was capped a mere 6 months into its unveiling with fewer than 5 payouts. And we know from at least 2 sources that you must navigate a bloated bureaucracy and get the approval of a second-rate doctor, i.e. your local medical officer of health, who never actually assesses you to have your vaccine injury formally government recognized. And if you're like slandered and smeared ER physician Dr. Phillips, your license to practice medicine will be stripped from you if you try to document vaccine injuries.
I think it's safe to say that these risks are extremely low and acceptable.
I think that they should tell that to Kevin Street, the first person to come forward with debilitating neurological and cognitive malfunction after the AstraZeneca shot. Or Maddie DeGarry, the 12-year-old Pfizer clinical trial volunteer who is tube-fed and catheter relieved and completely ignored by the medical establishment. Or what about 17-year-old Jasmine Cuomo, who is wheelchair-bound post-injection? There's 16-year-old Kiana, who experienced seizures following her first Pfizer dose. Meredith, who explains the complexities of the multi-level filtering Canadian adverse events following immunization surveillance system. Or the grieving father of healthy 17-year-old Sean Hartman, who died suddenly a month after his first Pfizer dose. And of course, there's the countless other vaccine injury stories that I have personally reported on. Remember when healthy athletes dropping dead was rare? Well, it's not anymore.
High school senior is in the hospital after collapsing on the tennis courts.
Breaking new details on the deaths of a high school soccer player.
Finland, Denmark's star man Christian Eriksen collapsing towards the end of the first half.
The Kennedy High community mourning tonight after one of their high school football players died.
A South Carolina high school football player has died after collapsing at football practice.
Star college basketball player collapsing on the court. We want to warn you, the video may be difficult to watch.
But this is all just a coincidence, right? Nothing to see here. Obviously, it's all mis and disinformation. So let's go back to this holy grail of scientific knowledge with their science-y Swiss cheese model.
So vaccination will provide the dead ends for that virus. Some of you may have heard there's something called this Swiss cheese model of prevention, right? And so every strategy is like one piece of Swiss cheese. And if you look at a piece of Swiss cheese, there's holes in that, right? And so no strategy is 100%, right? So there's always going to be holes where that virus can get through. But if you stack up enough pieces of Swiss cheese side by side together, and then ask that virus to try and get through all of those different mitigation strategies, it won't get through.
Does this sound like Science Sam or more like Science Scam? And how much did Science Sam get paid to do this engagement? And what exactly did it say? Support our efforts to find out at rebelinvestigates.com. For Rebel News, I'm Tamara Ugolini. The pandemic profiteers want you to follow their science unquestionably, and they work hard to slander, silence, and smear anyone who thinks differently. If you want to support our efforts to end medical censorship, you can head over to our campaign at stopmedicalsilencing.com, sign the petition, and check out our other reports. That's stopmedicalsilencing.com.